Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Consumption, Work and the Self. One of the things I'm going to be talking about today is the idea that we're living in a networked society.
Because you've always lived in it, it might not feel particularly new or different, but it's not the way we've always lived. And I kind of have, in my lifetime, witnessed this increasing networking wasn't always available. For example, we didn't in Australia always get instant access to the news in the same way that we do now. So we're much more connected to the rest of the world. So some of the questions that I want to ask is, what does it mean to live in an increasingly networked society? And information society is what some people talk about. Is social media good for our well-being as individuals and as a community? And you're probably all aware of the criticisms of people being on phones all the time or being on screens all the time and not physically connecting in some way with people. So, you get a line of people at the bus stop and they're not talking to each other, but they're on their screens or whatever. Are we becoming a more efficient society because of all this technology that we have? Are we staying in touch more often? Or are we, ironically, more lonely? And that is one of some of the research that I'm going to suggest later on suggests that we are, interestingly, in a time of increased connection, supposedly through technology, we actually are more lonely as a society. And I guess with social media, and we've touched on this in conversation already, can we experiment with our identities in different and meaningful ways? Or are we creating identities online that don't actually match up with the way that we really live? Perhaps we don't want people to know how we really live. Like, I don't want people to catch me without having done my housework, but see how I really live. Are we kind of doing that sort of thing online? I wanted to start off at a very large macro level, what we call the macro level, which is beyond, in this case, in terms of Castells, it's beyond the nation state. He's looking kind of at the world globally. Manuel Castells, his name is, he's Spanish, born in 1942, and kind of a very foremost sociologist when it comes at looking the huge picture of global situation. Where he's thinking of what a network society is, he's thinking of a society whose social structure is made up around networks activated by technology, by microelectronics-based, digitally processed information and communication technology. So a different sort of society than we've had in the past, where it might have been networked around people. Now we're networking around technology, is what he's suggesting in our network society. What he's suggesting is that power has shifted. It's shifted from nation states now into global networks. The examples there that I can think of are huge multinational corporations. So if you think about Rupert Murdoch and his New Media Corporation, I would suggest he probably has more power than the Australian government. But then I also think about Toyota and Holden, the car manufacturers. They have so much power that they've been able to withdraw manufacturing from Australia and devastate regions in Australia by creating unemployment. So that's what he's talking about there, that the global organisations will have far more power than nation states, particularly a smallish nation state like Australia. But I must admit, as I was thinking about this, I think we should probably keep in mind Donald Trump and Brexit and the pulling back to the nation state that seems to be perhaps a reaction to this globalising network society. He reckons now that that's one consequence, is less power at the nation state level. But he says another consequence is increasing freedom for all of us, so that the trajectory of our lives becomes our responsibility. So instead of living in a little community where it's kind of mapped out, your gender roles already mapped out, you're going to get married, you're going to have children, you're going to perhaps be the local teacher or something like that. Suddenly, because we have this network society, the world is kind of our oyster and we can go and do everything. So lots of lots of freedom there. We're no longer necessarily constrained by staying in our family. We can move, and we have international students here who illustrate this for us all the time. And then we also encourage, domestic students to go overseas and do that world exploration as well. So lots and lots of movement, no longer being constrained. And he contrasts that really with kind of pre-industrial tribal, not tribal so much as feudal societies, where people did have an expectation for the rest of their life. They would have their children, their families, and not move very, very far from their local areas. And in some ways, that represents restriction, but in some ways it also represents security. So what he suggests is that we're more connected and networked and have this endless choice, but the endless choice is all up to us, and it can actually be paralysing rather than feel empowering. You can have so much choice. I don't know whether you've ever gone to the supermarket. I certainly have gone to the supermarket, and there's such an array of choice, and I go, oh my God, and I leave without buying anything. I suddenly feel as if I don't know what option to take. So it's that sort of thing he suggests is happening. And interestingly enough, we do have a rise of anxiety amongst young people, and so some sociologists are suggesting that's connected to two things. One, this endless choice, but also this sense of responsibility now that we're not following in any sort of community expectations of us. We can go and do what we want, but the burden then is placed on us. So it's both, like most things, there's benefits and pros and cons to it. So all of that choice can be empowering and really exciting. It can also mean, oh my God, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do. So that unpredictability then, you don't have the security. So it can be exciting, no doubt about that, but it can also be anxiety inducing. He's interested in things like power, and power in a network society he doesn't see as located in an individual. And in this sense, he reminds me very much of Michel Foucault, where he thinks about, Castells thinks about power in terms of relational capacities. So it's the capacity that enables somebody, a social actor. Many of the sociologists say actor rather than individual or person. So that enables a person to influence asymmetrically, so have more influence than you would think they should have, to influence what other people do in ways that favour the individual who's doing the influencing. So he's interested in that, and he talks about how there are two mechanisms of power which is worth thinking about based on our conversation around Bourdieu last week, that there is violence is definitely an expression of power, but there's also discourse and legitimated discourse as well. And we talked about those who had last week, those who have cultural capital do have the ability then to shape what we see as normative, the way in which we're supposed to live. And not just the way in which we're supposed to live in terms of where we live, but even down to what our bodies are supposed to look like and the way that we speak. It involves a process of legitimation, because not all discourse is legitimate or legitimised. I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that he's influenced by Marx, because he definitely has this conflict perspective that the nature of society is ongoing conflict. And the way, therefore, to think about societies now are not as communities sharing values, but act as contradictory social structures that are always in conflict and negotiating with each other. And even at the individual level, because we have this freedom to do what we want to do, we can now negotiate our way through things. So there is an element of conflict. And he reckons that this is because we've moved from tribal societies to kind of feudal societies with the aristocrats and the peasants, to the transformation that happened through industrialisation, to what we have now, which he calls really a democratic marketplace all the time. For him, A network is this interconnected set of nodes, very, very open-ended, and there are patterns of contact that are created by a flow of messages, and this kind of comes from the computing industry anyway. The whole idea of network is computing language. He reckons what we've got to look at now is not social boundaries, and we talked about social boundaries quite a lot last week in talking about old-fashioned, really I think in many ways old-fashioned references to lower class, that's a social boundary, to middle class, another social boundary, and to upper class. He says we can't do that anymore. And think about the omnivore conversation that we had last week. So no longer looking at those social boundaries, we're more looking at the networks and what's going on in networks. Therefore, how does power operate through the networks? And there's still exclusionary things that are going on. So if you think about, so many of our core human activities are now global. So we buy our clothes from everywhere, they're located everywhere in the world. We import food. Even though we export quite a lot of food, we still import food so that we can have strawberries in the middle of winter because they've come in often from America. We have gone global in many, many ways. So he's interested in how that then power operates through that. And he reckons that these networks still can be quite exclusionary because it depends on who sets up the network and then what is going on within that network. So, for example, if you're excluded from the finance network, then you don't have the right language, you're not included in it. So it's a global network, absolutely, but it still has boundaries around it, and there'll be people on the inside and people on the outside as well. So it's not as if these networks are inclusive of everyone, is really his point. It's the power of the network. The finance industry, for example, who will have all the right language, the discourse of that particular network, and then they will impose the rules on people outside of the network. In that sense, power has shifted from the lower class, the middle class, the upper class, to spreading across different networks, which might be inclusive of all of those social groups, but there will still be people on the outside of the network. And those who don't create the network still then therefore have to comply with the rules of those who've set the network up. So he asks, has the emphasis on this global society had an impact on our relationships at the local level? Are our local structures actually becoming less and less relevant? And many people say yes. I wanted to move on to Zygmunt Bauman because he talks about declining local social ties. So we're connected globally, but what's going on now at a micro level? So that's at the macro level, what's going on at the micro level? The concern is Castells, but it's also Bauman. I'm going to come to him in a minute. Is networking actually impacting our ability to have strong local connections, committed bonds? People in local communities, think about those feudal communities, they would have been there for generations, and the same people that they mixed with. Now, on the one hand, we might say, well, that's very boring, they didn't get to meet lots of new people, and therefore that's not exciting. But on the other hand, there was an enormous sense of security and a sense of belonging because you knew people who knew you for generations. That's the question. Is networking that we're now doing negatively impacting on our ability to have close, solid social ties, and ones that last for a long period of time as well? Are our connections, therefore, more superficial, more shallow, more fragmented, kind of all over the place, and more conditional? And by conditional are our relationships with people conditional on their usefulness to us in the present time? So when somebody's usefulness is gone, do we give up that relationship is the question. Or are we simply, and there are opposing views on this, and you might sit on either side of a fence or somewhere in the middle, are we simply reimagining the way in which we relate to each other today? So Bowman has this idea of liquid modernity, that everything is moving, nothing is fixed anymore. We don't have the nation-state boundaries is not as fixed and firm, even though some nation-states, as I said with the United States, are now trying to fix and firm them a little bit. And we've tried to do that here quite a bit in terms of refugees recently. These days, you can do a whole lot more than you used to be able to do because things aren't so fixed, boundaries aren't as fixed. Think about gender boundaries are not as fixed, much more fluid than they used to be. Bowman reckons that this leads to a decline in the relationships that we have, in the social bond is problematic. He sees it as a problem because we don't want those close family ties that go back for generations. We want liquid or fluid bonds rather than the fixed and solid ones, so that we can get on and move on and not have to make an agonised decision about whether we're going to leave and go to another country, but feel free to do that. He reckons that relationships today are really until further notice. They're not fixed. They're going to be just temporary, that might suit a job, university, a particular context. They're really just there until we don't need the relationship anymore. And he reckons that this is in this era of instant gratification where we can go and get what we need. It's very different to a time when we would have had to save up, for example. We approach relationships, and I'd be curious to see what you think about this. He reckons we approach relationships now as we do any other consumer product to fulfill our needs, interestingly enough. He goes on to say that, therefore, the internet's fantastic because it does give us this opportunity to connect up with people all over the world, but that connection is not for very long. Once, the interest is gone, then the connection has gone as well. So that's kind of an upside and a downside to that. He reckons that this reflects a growing tendency in sociability, and I'm going to quote from him here, where he reckons relationships are looser and aestheticised and evaluated in terms of the capacity to offer beauty, desirability and pleasure. And this, he says, leads to the subjective experience. Because we're always looking for something from that relationship, it leads to a subjective experience of isolation and loneliness. We can actually measure something like isolation and loneliness by doing surveys, by doing interviews and things with people. In this study, this is Baker's 2012 study, and I couldn't find a more recent one, but the rate of loneliness amongst Australians had increased from 2001 to 2009, and we've had a lot of increase in networking and connectivity over that period, almost doubling from 2.2% in 2002 to 4.3% in 2007, so the two periods of measuring that. I did find Michelle Lim is at Swinburne University, is kind of an expert in this area, and she reckons that loneliness is, she didn't have any recent figures on over 2012, but she did say that loneliness is a risk factor in a number of diseases, including obesity, and that connections to family, extended family, membership in other groups, for example, sporting groups or professional associations, are all looser because we're all on our own journey. Remember Castell's idea that we have responsibility for where we end up in life now. So we're all on our own individual journey. And while that suggests a lot of freedom, it can also suggest loneliness and extra burden on us as well. Bowman reckons that this contemporary liquid modernity that we're living in, where we have this freedom, means a running battle, he says, for, and I'm quoting, the desire for freedom and the need for security, and security and freedom don't really go together, because with security there's a lot of constraint, and with freedom you can go and do everything, but you don't have the security of knowing what tomorrow is going to be like. It goes on to say, haunted by fear of loneliness and a dread of incapacitation. It sounds very doom and gloom, doesn't it? But in actual fact, loneliness is now a recognised public health issue. And in May 2018, the federal government announced $46 million towards a community visitor scheme to reduce loneliness in older adults. And figures show that there's 9 million people in the UK who feel lonely. So it does seem like this interesting contradiction that on the one hand we're entirely networked and connected, and on the other hand we have increasing loneliness. So that's what the sociologists are interested in. Stanley Eisen's architecture of isolation, he reckons that the way in which we design houses now, where we have points of connection to technology all over the house, means that we have, leads to a rise in loneliness as well, and isolation, because we're off doing our own thing. Now, a really good example of that is, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago the show Back in Time for Dinner, where they're looking at Australian family life from the 1950s through to contemporary life. And the houses in the 1950s were all closed off, and they were just congregated in one very small room. But the family, when they went through that, said, oh my God, we're all talking to each other. And then as time went on, the house opened up to the outside, almost like a metaphor for me of the way in which Australian society has opened up. But then technology came in, and all of a sudden everyone was back on their individual phones. So even though things were much more open, people were doing their own thing, and the family were not as connected as they used to be. And that's what he's talking about there, where we can have Wi-Fi all over the house. We have rooms that everybody can have their own room. So that sort of trend towards having our own space is great on one hand, but also can have problems on the other hand. He reckons there's also a decline in the use of public spaces. We still have public spaces. People are less inclined to be outside. The decline of social capital and connectedness, the things that we used to have to go and do quite regularly, so the rise of refrigerators, which I think is a great idea, but it means that people don't have to go to the shops and connect with people as often as they used to. And even if you think about online shopping, you don't have to go to the shops at all anymore. It can just be delivered, and you don't necessarily have to have very much contact with people. So on the one hand, a rise in convenience, absolutely, but does that always encourage improved relationships? And he also reckons because we're so mobile, because we are moving around quite a bit, because we don't necessarily stay in the one city or state or country anymore, therefore we don't necessarily invest in our local communities. So there's a depletion there. And critics of the internet argue that humans need intimacy and connection, and that face-to-face contact is really important for that. They argue that the internet privatises consumption, so that those transactions that I was talking about that once involved meeting somebody else, even briefly, are disappearing now because we can do so much of that online. But there is a counter, so I did want to mention that as well. So Stefana Broadbent is an anthropologist, so I'm going to bring her up and show you some of her research, because she says that intimacy is not declining, intimacy is increasing through technology.
I believe that there are new hidden tensions that are actually happening between people and institutions. Institutions that are the institutions that people inhabit in their daily life. Schools, hospitals, workplaces, factories, offices, etc. And something that I see happening is something that I would like to call a sort of democratization of intimacy. And what do I mean by that? I mean that what people are doing is, in fact, they are sort of, with their communication channels, they are breaking an imposed isolation that these institutions are imposing on them. How are they doing this? They're doing it in a very simple way, by calling their mum from work, by IMing from their office to their friends, by texting under the desk. The picture that you're seeing behind me are people that I visited in the last few months. And I asked them to come along with the person they communicate with most. And somebody brought a boyfriend, somebody a father. One young woman brought her grandfather. For 20 years, I've been looking at how people use channels such email, the mobile phone, texting, etc. What we're actually going to see is that fundamentally people are communicating on a regular basis with 5, 6, 7 of their most intimate sphere. Now let's take some data. Facebook. Recently, some sociologists from Facebook. Facebook is, I mean, the channel that you would expect is the most enlarging of all channels. And an average user, said Cameron Marlowe from Facebook, has about 120 friends, but he actually has two-way exchanges with about 4 to 6 people on a regular basis, depending on his gender. Academic research on instant messaging also shows 100 people on buddy lists, but fundamentally people chat with 2, 3, 4, anyway less than 5. My own research on cell phones and voice calls showed that 80% of the calls are actually made to 4 people, 80%. And when you go to Skype, it's down to 2 people. A lot of sociologists actually are quite disappointed. I mean, I've been a bit disappointed sometimes when I saw this data, all this deployment just for 5 people. And some sociologists actually feel that that it's a closure, it's a cocooning, that we're disengaging from the public. And I would like to show you that if we actually look at who is doing it and from where they're doing it, actually there's an incredible social transformation. There are 3 stories that I think are quite good examples. The first gentleman, he's a baker, and so he starts working every morning at 4 o'clock in the morning. And around 8 o'clock, he sort of sneaks away from his oven, cleans his hands from the flour, and calls his wife. He just wants to wish her a good day, because that's the start of her day. And I've heard this story a number of times. A young factory worker who works night shifts, who manages to sneak away from the factory floor, where there's CCTV, by the way, and find a corner where at 11 o'clock at night he can call his girlfriend and just say good night. Or a mother who at 4 o'clock, suddenly manages to find a corner in the toilet to check that her children are safely home. Then there's another couple. There's a Brazilian couple. They've lived in Italy for a number of years. They Skype with their families a few times a week. But once a fortnight, they actually put the computer on their dining table, pull out the webcam, and actually have dinner with their family in Sao Paulo, and they have a big event of it. And I heard this story the first time a couple of years ago from a very modest family of immigrants from Kosovo in Switzerland. They had set up a big screen in their living room, and every morning they had breakfast with a grandmother. But Danny Miller, who's a very good anthropologist who's working on Filipino migrant women who leave their children back in the Philippines, was telling me about how much parenting is going on through Skype, and how much these mothers are engaged with their children through Skype. And then there's the third couple. They're 2 friends. They chat to each other every day, a few times a day, actually. And finally, they've managed to put instant messaging on their computers at work. And now, obviously, they have it open. Whenever they have a moment, they chat to each other. And this is exactly what we've been seeing with teenagers and kids doing it in school, under the table, and texting under the table to their friends. So none of these cases are unique. I mean, I could tell you hundreds of them. But what is really exceptional is the setting. So think of the 3 settings I've talked to you about. Factory, migration, office, but it could be a school, it could be an administration, it could be a hospital. 3 settings that if we just step back 15 years, if you just think back 15 years, when you clocked into an office, when you clocked into a factory, there was no contact for the whole duration of the time. There was no contact with your private sphere. I mean, if you were lucky, there was a public phone hanging in the corridor somewhere. If you were in management, that was a different story. Maybe you had a direct line. If you were not, you maybe had to go through an operator. But basically, when you walked into those buildings, the private sphere was left behind you. And this has become such a norm of our professional life, such a norm and such an expectation. And it had nothing to do with technical capabilities. The phones were there, but the expectation was once you moved in there, your commitment was fully to the task at hand, fully to the people around you. That was where the focus had to be. And this has become such a cultural norm that we actually school our children for them to be capable to do this cleavage. If you think nursery, kindergarten, the first years of school are just dedicated to take away the children, make them used to staying long hours away from the family. And then the school enacts perfectly well, it mimics perfectly all the rituals that we will find in offices. Rituals of entry, rituals of exit, the schedules, the uniforms in this country, things that identify you, team building activities, team building that will allow you to basically be with a random group of kids or a random group of people that you will have to be for a number of time. And of course, the major thing, learn to pay attention. Concentrate and focus your attention. This only started about 150 years ago. It only started with the birth of modern bureaucracy and of industrial revolution, when people basically had to go somewhere else to work and carry out the work. And when, with modern bureaucracy, there was a very rational approach where there was a clear distinction between the private sphere and the public sphere. So until then, basically, people were living on top of their trades. They were living on top of the land they were laboring. They were living on top of the workshops where they were working. And if you think it's permeated our whole culture, even our cities. If you think of medieval cities, the boroughs have the names of the guilds and professions that lived there. Now we have sprawling residential suburbia that are well distinct from production areas and commercial areas. And actually, over these 150 years, there's been a very clear class system that also has emerged. So the lower the status of the job and of the person carrying out, the more removed he would be from his personal sphere. People have taken this amazing possibility of actually being in contact all through the day or in all types of situations. And they're doing it massively. The Pew Institute, which produces good data on a regular basis on, for instance, in the States, says that, and I think this number is conservative, 50% of anybody with email access at work is actually doing private email from his office. I really think that the number is conservative. In my own research, we saw that the peak for private email is actually 11 o'clock in the morning, whatever the country. 75% of people admit doing private conversations from work on their mobile phones. 100% are using text. The point is that this reappropriation of the personal sphere is not terribly successful with all institutions. I'm always surprised that the US Army sociologists are discussing of the impact, for instance, of soldiers in Iraq having daily contact with their families. But there are many institutions that are actually blocking this access. And every day, every single day, I read news that make me cringe, like $15 fine to kids in Texas for using every time they take out their mobile phone in school. Immediate dismissal to bus drivers in New York if seen with a mobile phone in a hand. Companies blocking access to IM or to Facebook. Behind issues of security and safety, which have always been the arguments for social control, in fact, what is going on is that these institutions are trying to decide who, in fact, has a right to self-determine their attention, to decide whether they should or not be isolated, and how, and they are actually trying to block, in a certain sense, this movement of a greater possibility of intimacy. Okay.
So that's another perspective, that in actual fact there's this democratization of intimacy, so that people who used to be low on the totem pole now have access to technology so they can keep in connection with their families, whereas in the past they were excluded from doing that. You will see lots of ongoing debate about productivity in Australia declining because people are engaged in personal emails or looking at Facebook or whatever during their working day. Do any of you do that, do personal stuff on email when you're at work? So she's in favour of that, very clearly. Other people aren't in favour of that because they'll feel as if they're not getting their money's worth out of a worker. And as she said, there was always the difference for the people higher up the hierarchy. They always had access in some way, more so than people further down the hierarchy. Just wanted to have a look at some sociology research on social networking sites, and most of the studies do focus on identity construction, how we do that now through signs and symbols, and the networking patterns and the implications of that for our private versus our work identities as well. And there's a very big difference using something like Facebook, which is a social networking site, to using LinkedIn, which is a professional networking site. People do ask questions about what our online interests tell us about ourselves, and so the materials of our social identity have changed quite a lot. They're much more ephemeral or virtual these days than they used to be. The rise of the consumer cultures that we're talking from the late 20th century, when we had access to money and through credit, and where we had access to more and more goods, in part because of globalisation as well. But that became what we consumed, therefore became an integral part of our identity, and we've talked a bit about that in previous weeks, about how we learnt to consume and the various influences on us for that, and how our tastes then reinforce who we are and where we learnt our tastes from. So we can express and experiment, therefore, with our identities now on online interfaces as well. An early study looked at MySpace. I don't know, you were too young to have used MySpace. That was gone, I suppose, before you came along. I think some of the ideas apply to current platforms as well. So they were looking at sort of what they call the taste statements being performed by young people using this social networking site. Kind of indicated that our lists of cultural interests are fashioned into these taste statements that are yet then used or utilised as taste performances, which then reminds me of Goffman and his impression management. So we're wanting online to create a particular impression. There is, of course, great variation across the taste norms, as we've talked about in class, certainly thinking about Bourdieu. And they reckon that those interested in pop culture or various subcultures, which makes a lot of sense to me, were more coherent. They didn't have tastes all over the place, but if you belong to a particular subculture, like goths perhaps, then you'd have a coherent picture of that on your social networking site. There did seem to be values of authenticity as prestige attached to those groups as well. Farquhar's study does consciously use Goffman's performance of self. So what he was writing in the 1970s, he argues it still holds true for today. So what we're doing online is exaggerating some aspects of our identity, because we all have different parts to our identity or different aspects to it. So we exaggerate it in order to make clear to an audience which group we belong to. So we might be interested in sport, for example, and a whole lot of other things, including partying and politics, but we might exaggerate the emphasis on sport to make it very clear that we belong to a particular sporting group. And the messages, as you would know, are then controlled through the pictures that we put online. And in this study, he says that the users then skew what they present to construct a particular image of themselves. Interesting. So he's saying that people are very aware that when they're putting pictures online and constructing a particular identity, they're very, very clear that they're constructing this, that this is not totally who they are, for example. It's an aspect of themselves, they're exaggerating it, they're very aware of that. However, when they see somebody else's images online, they believe that about the other person, that that's all true about the other person. So very aware of what's going on for themselves, not sceptical or aware about what's going on. Believe when somebody else presents this fantastic, happy, successful life, they believe it. The question is that the whole idea of networking is that it is to network, make connections with a wide range of people. You hear career services talk about that all the time. It's great to network, or if I'm invited to any event, there's always a networking opportunity. That networking involves this chain of connections, very much similar to what Castell was saying at that macro level. We're now talking at a micro level. So we're going to make new connections with business people, people we might want to have a relationship, closer relationship with. But sociologists said that there's a certain set of assumptions that perhaps we should think about with the social networking sites. That there is a need for us to make connections, and is there? I guess I'd ask that question in light of what we just saw, that out of 120 Facebook friends, or some people have thousands, we actually only communicate with a few. So is there a need for us to make further connections is one thing. And that using this network of connections is the best way to do that anyway. Is it the best way? And that making this easy to do is of enormous benefit. I'm not entirely sure that it is. I'm sure it's a benefit for some people. And I was thinking about Taylor Swift recently, who has billions of followers, and she has enormous power because of the enormous number of followers that she has. But perhaps she'd have that anyway because of her influence of a celebrity. But for most of us ordinary people, is it of enormous benefit? I'm not so sure. The whole idea of constructing the self, but which one are we constructing? So when we have a face-to-face connection with people, there is something about our physical appearance. So people usually know which sex we are through our appearance, our ethnicity. There's a lot of things that we can't hide, and people will make assumptions about our general appearance. In contrast, however, our online settings means that individuals can actually present their ideal self and perhaps try on and experiment with different identities. So we can express a now self or a possible self, some sort of future self. And the possible self can be created by withholding information. So we don't tell the whole story. We don't tell about the messy home that we live in because we haven't cleaned up recently. So we repress aspects of ourselves. We're not entirely forthcoming or frank or honest about it. The idea that we're presenting ourselves differently is based on who we're talking to and the sort of conversation, therefore, we imagine that we're having. So who is the audience that we have in mind that we're imagining when we're presenting ourselves online? And usually we have a sense of an audience in any sort of mediated conversation. And we talked a bit about that in terms of the looking glass self with Cooley weeks ago as well. And often that audience is imagined, and sometimes it's just a pure fantasy. Technology then complicates our concepts of time and place. Who is our imagined audience? Is our online presence just limited to the few people that we know? In which case, maybe we will be a little bit more open. Or are we self-promoting ourselves and hoping to connect with people who think we're marvellous and will offer us a job? In which case, we won't. We will definitely keep some aspects of ourselves private.
Marwick and Boyd did a study back in 2011 around Twitter, and the questions that they were asking Twitter users were: who do you imagine reading your tweets? Who do you tweet to? What makes an individual seem authentic on Twitter? What won't you tweet about? And what subjects are inappropriate to tweet? So what they found is that Twitter flattens audiences into one audience, really. So multiple audiences that you might imagine if we were in a face-to-face setting. Might have one audience that's friends and one audience that's a little bit more formal. However, that doesn't happen on Twitter. There's this flattening. So that means you can't navigate these different audiences, as Goffman says that social actors do. So it creates a lot more complications for the self. It makes it impossible then to employ the sorts of strategies that you would use, the self-presentation strategies that you would use in face-to-face contacts. So what people do, the audience, the research has found, is that users use multiple perspectives. So instead of doing different self-presentation strategies face-to-face to multiple audiences, what they do is set up a range of different accounts and with pseudonyms, etc. So they, in a sense, I suppose, split themselves into these multiple perspectives in order to take account of the multiple audiences that are there, which are flattened into one. So they're strategically concealing information and trying to strike this balance between what they should show, and that might be more of themselves on one Twitter account, and what they're concealing on another Twitter account in order to seem authentic. There is an idea in the sociological literature that these anonymous social networking sites provide very fertile ground for narcissism, where narcissism is a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and an exaggerated sense of self-importance. This is seen that way because, first of all, the applications offer this gateway to hundreds of other relationships, many if not most of which will be quite shallow. Second, the social networking sites offer highly controlled environments that users actually have almost full control over. So they can set up very attractive self-promoting images. Users can also provide desirable information about themselves, not just through photographs, but through features like the About Me and the status updates. And these statements can be both implicit, so implied through photographs, and explicit through autobiographical descriptions. Because we are all striving for a positive sense of self, it's no surprise that individuals will attempt to construct positive images of themselves. And this, the researchers argue, might be even more so for those who have a sense of, well, a low sense of self-worth, I guess. So in this study, it was found that there is a significant negative correlation between self-esteem and Facebook activity. So specifically those who rated lower on what's called the Rosenberg self-esteem scale spent more time on Facebook, and therefore there's a correlation between self-esteem and narcissism. But I'm really curious to know what you all think about that, so I hope we get to talk about that in class.
So gamification is the idea that we make daily activities more enjoyable, like exercise, etc., more like a game. So it requires players and goals. And this is now called the quantification of the self amongst sociologists. So we're quantifying ourselves. We're collecting, we're analysing data, we're providing better feedback to ourselves on how to better care for ourselves. There's a lot of pleasure from doing that, and the whole idea is not to whip us into doing things through fear, but to give us lots of pleasure and incentives. So quantification relies on this data collection and then visualising the data and then cross-referencing it.
Many sociologists say that we're increasingly being encouraged to surveil ourselves. We're scrutinising ourselves all the time, and we've internalised a lot of social norms that we're supposed to be living up to, and now we're disciplining ourselves using technology to fall in line with those normative expectations. What Whitson suggests is that we should analyse the social effects of gamification and quantification through the frame of play rather than just through the lens of surveillance. She says that the public are increasingly self-surveilling due to the element of play that is involved. An example she gives is of Facebook tagging. If that was done by the state or the military, we might not see that as fun, and yet on Facebook it's seen as less threatening. So play is seen as a non-serious pursuit to provide downtime from daily responsibility, yet as Goffman says, play is quite a serious social interaction. Games require players. They require goals, they're inherently social, and they encourage us to conform as well. Gary Wolfe says something totally different, and so we're going to finish off today's lecture by listening to him.
I got up this morning at 6:10 a.m. after going to sleep at 12:45 a.m. I was awakened once during the night. My heart rate was 61 beats per minute. My blood pressure 127/74. I had 0 minutes of exercise yesterday, so my maximum heart rate during exercise wasn't calculated. I had about 600 milligrams of caffeine, 0 of alcohol, and my score on the Narcissism Personality Index, or the NPI-16, is a reassuring 0.31. We know that numbers are useful for us when we advertise, manage, govern, search. I'm going to talk about how they're useful when we reflect, learn, remember, and want to improve. A few years ago, Kevin Kelly, my partner, and I noticed that people were subjecting themselves to regimes of quantitative measurement and self-tracking that went far beyond the ordinary familiar habits, such as stepping on a scale every day. People were tracking their food via Twitter, their kids' diapers on their iPhone. They were making detailed journals of their spending, their mood, their symptoms, their treatments. Now, we know some of the technological facts that are driving this change in our lifestyle, the uptake, diffusion of mobile devices, the exponential improvement in data storage and data processing, and the remarkable improvement in human biometric sensors. This little black dot there is a 3D accelerometer. It tracks your movement through space. It's, as you can see, very small and also very cheap. They're now down to well under $1 a piece, and they're going into all kinds of devices. But what's interesting is the incredible detailed information that you can get from just one sensor like this. This kind of sensor is in the HIT biometric device among early adopters at the moment, the Fitbit. This tracks your activity and also your sleep. Has just that sensor in it. You're probably familiar with the Nike Plus system. I just put it up because that little blue dot is the sensor. It's really just a pressure sensor like the kind that's in a doorbell. And Nike knows how to get your pace and distance from just that sensor. This is the strap that people use to transmit heart rate data to the Nike Plus system. This is a beautiful new device that gives you detailed sleep tracking data, not just whether you're asleep or awake, but also your phase of sleep, deep sleep, light sleep, REM sleep. The sensor is just a little strip of metal in that headband there. The rest of it is the bedside console. Just for reference, this is a sleep tracking system from just a few years ago. I mean, really, until now. And this is the sleep tracking system of today. This just was presented at a healthcare conference in DC. Most of what you see there is an asthma inhaler. But the top is a very small GPS transceiver, which gives you the date and location of an asthma incident, giving you new awareness of your vulnerability in relation to time and environmental factors. Now, we know that new tools are changing our sense of self in the world. These tiny sensors that gather data in nature, the ubiquitous computing that allows that data to be understood and used, and of course the social networks that allow people to collaborate and contribute. But we think of these tools as pointing outward, as windows. And I'd just like to invite you to think of them as also turning inward and becoming mirrors, so that when we think about using them to get some systematic improvement, we also think about how they can be useful for self-improvement, for self-discovery, self-awareness, self-knowledge. Here's a biometric device, a pair of Apple earbuds. Last year, Apple filed some patents to get blood oxygenation, heart rate, and body temperature via the earbuds. What is this for? What should it be for? Some people will say it's for biometric security. Some people will say it's for public health research. Some people will say it's for avant-garde marketing research. I'd like to tell you that it's also for self-knowledge. The self isn't the only thing. It's not even most things. The self is just our operations center, our consciousness, our moral compass. So if we want to act more effectively in the world, we have to get to know ourselves better. Thank you.